Hello everyone, good evening. Wonderful to see so many of you here. Well done for choosing the best possible way to spend your Tuesday evening. And welcome also to people who are signing in from their sofas at home. Lovely to have you with us too. My name's Hannah McInnes. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you on behalf of the How To Academy and of the Conduit. And to have this chance to spend the next hour or so delving into this absolutely extraordinary book that takes us into the most weird and wonderful worlds. Well, actually, I don't think so much wonderful, but weird, very weird worlds. It is, of course, The Coming Storm, a journey into the heart of the conspiracy machine. And I'm thrilled to welcome its author. I think I should say at the outset that I am a very biased interviewer, not only because I'm sure, like many of you, I'm a huge fan of Gabriel's journalism, but also was lucky enough to be a colleague of his at Newsnight, and I always remember the day when we were told that Gabriel Gatehouse would be coming to join us, and everyone was very, very excited. You were about to object, I thought. Anyway, Gabriel was, of course, the international editor at BBC Newsnight. He was also the co-host of Ukrainecast on BBC Sounds. He's reported on almost all of recent conflicts across the world, from Iraq to Libya, Syria, Ukraine. He's won numerous awards. I don't have time to reel them all off. And of course, he is the host of the critically acclaimed and enormously popular success that is the Coming Storm podcast that was nominated for an Orwell Prize too. So, Gabriel, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know we're going to spend the next hour or so unpicking which storm this is. So it isn't a simple question, but just to sort of set the scene, can you tell us what this coming storm is and why you chose that as your title for podcast and book?
Yeah, so the storm is coming was this phrase that Q would use, this anonymous fantasy figure who started this movement, Q Andon, back in 2017, who sort of prophesied a great awakening. A storm was coming when this supposed cabal of elite paedophiles, possibly led by Hillary Clinton, or it was sort of amorphous depending on who was in the public eye at the time. But Hillary Clinton definitely had a central sort of place in it. The point at which this cabal would be unmasked and the whole house of cards would collapse. That was the storm, and it was coming. And it was constantly coming because it never actually quite came. But of course, I mean, there was January the 6th, which a lot of them, the storming of the Capitol, another storm. And a lot of QAnoners thought, when that happened, they thought, my God, this is the storm. Right? And then it didn't turn out their way, and Joe Biden got elected. So basically the storm is still coming. But the storm was both a reference to this QAnon belief, but also I found in sort of investigating this conspiracy theory and taking it seriously, though not literally, that it felt to me like there was actually a storm coming. There is some kind of this very widespread suspicion and dissatisfaction with the system and suspicion of our institutions and elites, which is perhaps stronger in America than it is here, but it's also kind of coming here. That does appear to be kind of building and coming to fruition. So that's the two meanings of the coming storm.
I mean, it's interesting whether you say it might be coming here or it is, but how much is it about America and what America is? I mean, you talk about so many of the people you talk to who buy into this are obsessed with the Constitution and very worried about where their country is going and moving away from the Constitution. Do you think it's unique to America and the stories that it tells itself, that people tell themselves?
It's not unique to America by any means, but this particular iteration of it is very particular to America, I think. And you pick up on the Constitution there, which is a big talking point for a lot of these people. And as we know, the paranoid style in American politics goes back to Hofstadter in the 1960s, but goes way further back than that. We've got McCarthyism and the opposition to FDR in the 30s and the New Deal, and really a lot of these arguments about big state versus small state, about the federal government versus the states, and the people who, in this kind of post-QAnon, post-January 6th world, the federal government is seen as this bogeyman, the instrument of tyranny that is hollowing out America's democracy from the inside and pulling strings, etc. I mean, this goes back to Hamilton and Jefferson, the founding fathers. This was a live argument at the founding of America, and perhaps it's an argument that the Hamilton side, the federal side, won for a very long time, especially in the post-war period. And we're now seeing a swing to the other side. That's just sort of one aspect of it.
I mean, you say, I've been reporting from America for many years. It was a paradise for journalists, a land full of great stories, colourful characters who were often too happy to tell them. But this was different.
Yeah.
So what makes this so different from the normal sort of mad, wild storytelling America that you love?
Well, I mean, in a way, I still love it because it is a brilliant place to work as a journalist, because people who have strange, offbeat ideas, in this country, I find, and in many other countries, they're confronted by an establishment journalist. They're guarded because they know that I'm going to think this is, but in America, and I try not to be too judgmental about this, because, as I said, I do think it's important to take conspiracy theories seriously, not literally, but seriously. Sometimes you should take them literally. I mean, conspiracies do exist. But anyway, not QAnon, obviously. But you take it seriously because it means something. But the great thing about Americans, I find, is that they're less guarded, right? They will, confronted by, and maybe it's being not American, maybe it's about being a Brit who speaks like this, hello. They do like that. They find that very charming, and I have used that to my advantage, as you'll probably know, working in America. You ham up the accent and you get all kinds of access, because I think they think it sounds clever. But people will be open, like the Q shaman, the guy who started this all off. Yeah. So I got down this rabbit hole, basically, because I was in Arizona just a couple of days after the polls had closed, but they were still counting the votes. And there's a small protest. They're chanting, "Stop the steal." They think the election's been stolen. And the most eye-catching guy is this guy with horns on his head.
I mean, you know the guy.
Draped in furs. And so I thought, and we were doing television, right? Television's a visual medium. You think, wow, this guy looks great. So I go over and talk to him. And as soon as he's very friendly, right? It's not aggressive, not mean, not nothing malign about him at all. But it sounds like he's ingested an encyclopedia of every single conspiracy theory ever dreamt up by a human brain and kind of regurgitating them in random order. So I thought of calling Jack over, the cameraman, to say, "Jack, get this guy. He looks brilliant." And then I talked to him, and I was like, "I can't do that. That's just, it's irresponsible. This guy's obviously an oddball."
I mean, that has to be very odd for it not to be something you'd want to use, as a story.
Well,
I
just thought, I felt at the time, and this was obviously wrong. This was a big miss, but I felt at the time that this was so niche that it would not be right for Newsnight. Newsnight's a serious program, and we shouldn't be in the business of giving inappropriate prominence to some pretty wild theories. As it turned out, this theory deserved its prominence because it was while niche, it was something that was going to drive, a few months later, it was going to drive the protesters into the Capitol. It was one of the kind of driving forces. But just to go back to sort of America and their openness, I do think that is something that is particular to America and some other countries. I found Pakistan similarly wonderfully open, and you get to speak to people who, might be very radical Islamists, for example, who would be very open to talking to you. So there are certain countries around the world that I've experienced where people are very open. America's one of them, Pakistan's another, a few others.
I mean, apart from that moment, which was one of the first, you go down many rabbit holes, as you say in the book, and many, and we will...
Hopefully we come out at some point.
But what else prompted it? I mean, it was actually an online drawing course about witches as well, wasn't it?
Well, that was my, my way in. So this was before I met the Q shaman with the horns and the furs. It was lockdown. And I was trying to get a visa to America. My visa had expired, and I was desperate to get across the Atlantic because Donald Trump had been talking up this kind of spectre of voter fraud, and I knew there was going to be trouble. I sensed it, and I kept. But it was COVID, right? So my visa, my 5-year visa, journalist visa, had expired. So I had to get the BBC top management to twist the State Department's arm to give me an appointment at the embassy in whatever it's called there in Wandsworth. What's it called now?
Nine Elms.
Nine Elms, Seven Oaks. So not which was closed, right? So I was waiting for this to happen. I was trying to take my mind off things, and for some reason I did this drawing class, and it was a kind of Halloween-themed thing with witches, and they were setting us kind of these exercises, copying out these kind of weird 15th century, 16th century prints. And this, one of the people giving the class, starts telling this story about this crazy book that appeared just at the time of the invention of the printing press. And it was this kind of crazed conspiracy theory about how every town and village is riddled with sex-obsessed satanic witches, and this guy was widely regarded at the time apparently as a total crank. The church was like, get this guy out of our town. But because of the printing press, he sort of managed to this narrative about witches spread through the towns and villages of Europe like a virus, and kind of ended up sparking the witch craze. And then I go over to America and I see all this QAnon stuff, and I'm thinking, history's repeating itself. So that was my kind of way in there, yeah.
I mean, and with, instead of the printing press, the internet, which before we come to, you're essentially tracing the roots of January the 6th, really, and you go back quite far back. But you start really with the Clintons. And I mean, how is it that the Clintons and what they stood for began these things sort of circulating?
It's funny, isn't it? Because you think of the Clintons as coming to Washington in 1993. The Cold War's just ended. All the arguments have been won by liberalism, basically. On the global stage, communism has died, liberal democracy, free market capitalism has won, and then in America, this kind of amazing sort of sense of euphoria around the Clintons after 12 years of sort of Republican rule and kind of liberalism in the White House, and Hillary Clinton, who was the first lady to set up to be a high-powered career lawyer in her own right, sets up an office in the West Wing, the center of power of the White House. Immediately, as soon as they get there, conspiracy theories start swirling around them. And they're being driven by, first of all, it's kind of talk radio and these weird sort of investment newsletters, and then, of course, the nascent internet. The reason I decided to kind of start with the Clintons was because of the centrality of Hillary Clinton as a figure in the QAnon conspiracy theory, right? So I decided to kind of trace it back, and the ground zero that we alighted on was this guy called Vince Foster. He was a friend of Bill's they'd been to the same nursery school, the Marie Purkis School for Little Folks in Hope, Arkansas. Bill Clinton went there. Vince Foster went there, who ended up being Deputy White House Counsel. And Mac McClarty, who was who was Bill Clinton's first chief of staff. So it was the most high-powered nursery school in American political history. Marie Purkis's School for Little Folks.
Had no idea.
Really hot housing there, little. Anyway, so Vince Foster comes to Washington. He's a very serious lawyer. He avoids the limelight. He's a personal friend of the Clintons. They're kind of from this same Arkansas milieu. He'd worked together with Hillary at the Rose Law Firm in Little Rock. And in the summer of 1993, he drives to a park just outside Washington, D.C., and shoots himself. And immediately these kind of conspiracy theories start swirling around it. There are 4 or 5 investigations into what happened. And they all say he committed suicide. But these conspiracy theories won't go away. And they're kind of driven at first by talk radio, kind of Rush Limbaugh, and then there's this videotape that's pushed by evangelical preachers, and it starts this narrative about something called the Clinton body count. Now, if you spend any time on the sort of conspiratorial end of American politics, you'll come across the Clinton body count, which is this theory that the Clintons, in their quest for power, have basically left behind them a trail of dead bodies in their wakes. People who've ended up in plane crashes, car crashes, have been, quote unquote, suicided. Obviously, there's no evidence that the Clintons have killed anyone. But Vince Foster is not chronologically the first on the list, but he's basically the kind of most important. And in a way, you can kind of see the Vince Foster as this pebble dropped in the pond that ripples out and ends up creating this tsunami that is QAnon.
Yeah, so is that pond the internet? I mean, it's places that you talk about, the Chans. Is it all happening there?
It was at a certain point, at a kind of crucial point in history, it was happening there. So the Chans, I'd never heard of the Chans until I started looking into this stuff. But 4chan and 8chan were these kind of very purposefully stripped back, user-unfriendly internet chat rooms, basically, that were frequented by like young guys who was kind of probably a bit too old to be still living in their parents' basements, but were still living in their parents' basements. And we're talking about sort of the mid-2010s, right? So post-financial crisis, pre-Trump election, pre the first Trump election. And these guys, they were basically, this is where the kind of incel movement came out of, this kind of, it was very, very male-heavy, male-dominated, involuntary celibates. These kind of guys who got no prospects in life, sitting around, spending all their time on the internet, trolling people, trolling for fun, trolling for sport, LARPing, which stands for live action role play, which is basically like, I don't know if anybody knows Dungeons and Dragons. I wasn't into it as a kid, but people were, where you pretend you take on a persona of somebody with a sword and you're fighting, I don't know, monsters. So that kind of role play game happened on the internet, and what would happen was on 4chan and 8chan, people would pretend to be high-level insiders with information, so that you had, and they were all anonymous. That was the whole point of it. So you had FBI anon and CIA anon and all these people pretending to be insiders in these intelligence agencies, but in fact they were kids in their parents' basements, overgrown kids in their parents' basements, and the people on 4chan who were reading this stuff also kind of knew that they were kids in their parents' basement, but it was a fun game to play, right? So they pretended to kind of drop information about the kind of nefarious goings-on in government, and the other people on 4chan would pretend to believe it and ask them questions and kind of search stuff on the internet, do their research, and find kind of things that would corroborate it. And this is the kind of soup out of which QAnon emerges. And it possibly, a bit like the book about the witches, had it not been for the printing press, it probably would have kind of just died a death in this kind of very niche part of the internet, had it not jumped off 4chan and 8chan and onto the mainstream internet, Reddit, Facebook, where the normies, people like you and me, I hope, kind of didn't really understand that this was a game, right? And that's where kind of QAnon started spreading like wildfire. First it was Pizzagate, and then it was QAnon, sort of 16, 17.
I mean, Pizzagate, when you reread about it, it is just utterly extraordinary. And I wonder if you can just sort of take us back there, because it feels to me that that was the time where you realised, or where it morphed into something that wasn't these kids in their parents' basements. Suddenly it was happening in real time, and you realised the utter absurdity of it all.
And it was very deliberately, by the way, spread by people in the Donald Trump campaign orbit. So Pizzagate appeared in 2016. The first rumbling started on 4chan, and it was somebody called FBI Anon, in fact, who was talking about the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, which of course was a real thing. But this guy was just some random guy who was like pretending to know lots of stuff about it, and kept saying, the whole Clinton crime family is about to be exposed and she's about to be arrested. All of these kind of tropes that would later play out in QAnon started in Pizzagate, and it's all started in the run-up to the 2016 election. And whoever this FBI Anon guy was, and we don't really know, it was picked up on by some people who were sort of working on a kind of grassroots campaign to get Trump elected. And they saw this stuff, and they realized that actually this could be useful. And the reason they thought it could be useful is because of the background of all the stuff that had happened in the 90s, right? The ground had been prepared, had been primed for an older generation who didn't understand the Chans, nevertheless to believe that the Clintons were criminals, right? Because of all this stuff from the 90s. So they very deliberately, and we know who they are, they're the people who did work on the Trump campaign, very deliberately put Pizzagate out there on the mainstream internet, Reddit, Facebook, Twitter. And that's where it caught on. And that really was the spark that kind of lit QAnon.
I mean, and someone turned up at the pizzeria where...
Yes, so one of those Trump people, are you talking about the guy with the gun? Or
both of those.
Yeah, right. So before the guy with the gun, so there was a guy called JackPOC, who's still around. You can look him up on Twitter.
And he's quite an important character.
He's a very important character. He's still an important character, actually. Yeah. Kind of stoking these conspiracy theories. He turns up at this... So the story is that what Pizzagate eventually boils down to is that apparently John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, big figure in Washington, D.C., had worked in the Clinton White House in the 90s, was running a sadistic child sex ring out of the basement of a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., called Comet Ping Pong. Out of the basement of a restaurant.
Everyone's laughing. This is why I want you to retell the story, because it just it is the one. It is of all the things, in a way, the most.
The key thing you need to know about the basement in this pizza restaurant is that the pizza restaurant does not have a basement. This is the key fact. Nevertheless, JackPOC, this troll, turns up there, live streaming, and goes into the restaurant. The staff are onto him, right, because this has already been kind of doing the rounds. They know what he's up to. They kick him out. So he goes back out again, and he continues live streaming on the pavement. And he said, "Yeah, we saw lots of children going in and out, and there were no children visible in his live stream previously. But he's just making it up." And this live stream is being watched tens. I can't remember the numbers, but a lot. And this is, I think this is just after the 2016 election. So the kind of shock of Trump's victory is still there. But what happens a few weeks later is, I don't know if we can make a causal relationship between JackPOC and this guy who eventually drives down from wherever he drives down from with his guns in his car and ends up shooting up the restaurant because he wants to go and save the children. That there are real-world consequences to this. I mean, luckily no one was hurt in the pizza incident, but people really believe this stuff.
And this, I mean, you call it a soup, a primordial soup, an essential ingredient in this. We're kind of going through the ingredients, but one of the essential ingredients is Trump, of course. Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't happen. Would it have happened without him?
I don't know the answer to that question. I'm instinctively shy away from ascribing too much agency to Trump. I think Trump is a kind of a raw-id politician. He just sort of, he's pure instinct, right? He rides the waves. There's that amazing clip, which if you've ever looked into QAnon, you will have seen. But it's so it's his first few months in office. It's in 2020. So it's coming up to the 2020 election, and QAnon has really started to sort of poke its head above the basements. It's coming out into the open. People are turning up at Trump rallies with Q signs and talking about this cabal of satanic pedophiles. And eventually, a reporter for some kind of mainstream news outlet brings it up at a White House briefing with Trump. And this journalist goes, can I ask you about QAnon? I'll just better explain what it is. It's this idea that you are battling, Mr. President, you are battling this cabal of satanic pedophiles and trying to bring them to justice. Is this something sounds like you might be involved in? And he goes, I haven't heard about that, but is that supposed to be a good thing or a bad thing?
Apparently they really like me.
Yes, I know they like me very much. So he has an absolute killer instinct for what is going to play well for him. And he understood, this is what Fred Brennan, the guy who created 8chan, that sort of really supercharged.
Who you interview quite extensively.
Yeah. He said that I don't think a lot of these people, Trump or people in his orbit, really knew where QAnon was coming from, but they knew it was useful to them, and they knew they wanted to use it and weaponize it, and they did. So Trump is an ingredient, and I think, I don't know whether it would or it wouldn't have happened without Trump. It wouldn't have happened in this way without Trump, but in a way, Trump became, for these people, he became the trolls president, right? There was this amazing scene on the night before his inauguration, the kind of these grassroots campaign for Trump, that was basically a troll farm. They put on a party at the National Press Club in Washington, this kind of august institution where the Washington Post and the New York Times would hold forth. And they booked it out, basically, and had their kind of convention of trolls, like a sort of like a witches' Sabbath, and where they all got together to sort of celebrate this surprise victory. And there was this one guy there who said to, I think it was Zoe Chase from This American Life, who got into the party, and this guy said, with sort of almost amazement and surprise, we memed him into the presidency, right? So Trump rode on their coattails with their kind of Pepe the Frog memes and all this kind of nods and winks to the alt-right. But they rode on his coattails. So then once, he got into the office, or into the Oval Office, that they had their guy, the troll in chief, was in the White House. So it was a kind of this symbiotic relationship.
And there is a moment, I think it was in the midterms, you say he turns up with, he has a QAnon storm is coming badge.
Yeah, he turns up with a Q pin. Again, he understands what is good. It was odd that he did that in the midterms, because by that time, Q, whoever they were, and we think that Q, kind of the person posting this nonsense, cycled through a good few different people, and there were sort of all kinds of behind-the-scenes battles for control of the Q account. But by the time Donald Trump turns up at the midterms wearing his little Q badge, Q is gone. He's gone silent. He's not saying anything anymore. So, I think this was a point where it's 2022, and Donald Trump was not certain whether the Republican Party was really going to go with him for 24, and he was desperately trying to, jack up a bit more. Yeah.
It's really interesting, your assessment of why QAnon works so well and kind of gets so many people on board. You say it's all about participation. It's about, this is happening now. You're involved. It is a game. It is a real-time game for people, because they're saying, Q, or the multiple Qs, is saying, come on, you can really make a difference.
Yeah, it's like a virtual reality role play game, because Q is saying to his audience, this is a plan to save the world, and you need anons, people, QAnon followers. You need to do the research and try and link the dots from all these cryptic clues that I'm posting in order to bring about the Great Awakening. So there's kind of, one part of it is Dungeons and Dragons, and the other part of it is sort of evangelical Christianity, and it's like you must do your part in preparation for the Great Tribulation that is to come, and then the Great Awakening afterwards. So, yeah, it's this participatory element to it that makes it more than just a conspiracy theory. So, conspiracy theories, there are lots of them around. Did Lee Harvey Oswald, would he shoot John F. Kennedy, or was there somebody else involved? Was there a second gunman on the grassy knoll? If you think you know that there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll, that's great, right? You've got a bit of secret information, and that can make you feel clever. But with QAnon, you are literally taking part in saving the world, right? So it's really, people felt it was very important.
I feel like we must add another ingredient, one of your ingredients that I can't decide whether it was I learnt it from you or whether other people have spoken about the sovereign individual as being a big part of this. And people might be surprised that Jacob Rees-Mogg's father, has quite...
Mystic Mogg, as
Sprave
and I used to call it.
Mystic Mogg has such a prominent role in all of this, in the storm, or in your storm.
In my storm, yes. I don't know whether... I mean, of course, William Rees-Mogg is dead. He died in 2012. His co-author for that book is still alive and called me a tinfoil-hatted conspiracy theorist. Thank you.
Where did he call you that? Did he write to you to
He
say
wrote
it?
to me, yes. Kind of him, yes. I wrote to him, and he said that basically there's this book that was written in 1997, I think, sort of second half of the 90s, and it's sort of part crystal ball, part handbook of how to make a success of the transition to the digital age. So it's kind of mid-late 90s when the internet is really just beginning, and William Rees-Mogg and this guy James Dale Davidson, they're very prescient. They write this book about what's going to happen, and they foresee all kinds of things. They foresee cryptocurrencies. They foresee the gig economy. They foresee all kinds of things that have come to pass as a result of the internet. They're kind of on the money. And what they basically say is that the internet will destroy the ability of national governments, nation states, to perform their kind of traditional functions, collecting taxes and kind of providing the basic infrastructure of society, and that nation states will collapse. And in their place will rise sovereign individuals, people who are super powerful, sort of CEO kings of great transnational organizations that will be the new kind of societal order. And they love it, right? They're not like, oh God, it's all going to collapse. They're like, yay, brilliant. So I got into this book because the authors, William Rees-Mogg and James Dale Davidson, were peripherally involved back in the 90s in seeding all of these conspiracy theories about the Clintons, right? And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole. I think we should say, I think most people are susceptible to sort of conspiratorial thinking, especially when things look confusing, right? So you're like, this is very confusing. How on earth did Donald Trump get elected as president of the United States? And then it's QAnon, and were people in his orbit involved? And you start pulling at strings, you start making connections, and you start coming to conclusions. And I got quite deep into a rabbit hole whereby I wondered for a moment whether William Rees-Mogg and James Dale Davidson, who had written this book about how the democratic nation states would collapse and how they were absolutely mad for it and just couldn't wait for this to happen, And now it looked, after the storming of the Capitol, like things were looking a bit wobbly and democracy was in trouble. And it was kind of related to these Clinton conspiracy theories that they themselves had helped to seed in. So I started thinking, hey, hold on a second. What if these guys did this on purpose? They thought, oh, brilliant, we'll seed some conspiracy theories about the Clintons in the 90s, and like 25 years later, they'll all storm the Capitol. So obviously I kind of fell down my own rabbit hole a bit, right? And that's the rabbit hole I went down, and that's when I wrote to James Dale Davidson. He called me a tinfoil-hatted conspiracy theorist.
But then in describing that, are you wondering if, your own confusion, you say it's a very human thing, could have led you to... I mean, what's the difference? Is yours a conspiracy theory? You do
or
take
is it a conspiracy? Yeah.
Or is it a conspiracy? So you take it to a man, Tangalini.
The brilliantly named Tim Tangalini.
And he tells
Can you untangle my conspiracy theory, please?
But he stands it up.
Well, he kind of stands it up. What he says is... So I take in my conspiracy theory. I say, look, here are these guys that seeded conspiracy theories about the Clintons back in the 90s while predicting and hoping for a kind of collapse of the democratic order. And then, various people are pushing this, including big people in Silicon Valley. And lo and behold, have I fallen down a rabbit hole? And this guy, he's a folklorist, and he's teamed up with a computer scientist. And he basically has a way of testing the robustness of a narrative, right? And so he tested Pizzagate, basically, and Pizzagate was not very robust, as in the whole thing relied on the idea that when John Podesta in his emails wrote about pizza, it was secretly code for child porn, right? And if you took that element away, the whole thing was nonsense, especially since there was no basement in the place where it's supposed to be.
Was it like cheese pizza?
Pizza, child porn, and cheese pizza, child porn, Comet Ping Pong, CP, Captain Picard also got, anyway, anything with CP got, this was kind of just 4chan laughing around it. So he looked at my sort of suggestion that perhaps there was more to this than just the kind of accidental churn of history. And he was like, yeah, you're not a very good conspiracy theorist because you haven't for example, gone, William Rees-Mogg, son Jacob Rees-Mogg, used to work for Rothschild, boom, right? That's what any normal conspiracy theorist would do. As soon as you hit the Rothschilds, you're off and running, you're off to the races. But I hadn't done that, so that was kind of a point in my favor. So he said, keep digging, basically. So he sent me further down the rabbit hole. I came out of it thinking, of course, it's ludicrous to suggest that William Rees-Mogg sat around in the mid-90s and thought, aha, I can seed some conspiracy theories about the Clintons and, 25 years later, they'll storm the Capitol. I'll get Donald Trump to be... obviously, that didn't happen. But what I do kind of come to the conclusion is that, and this kind of goes back to what we started off with, is Hamilton versus Jefferson, these sort of currents of thinking, these battles within America and people who have interests working towards a certain end, that ends up, you end up finding a through line through the interests, through events that are shaped by people who have common interests across several generations.
But I mean, we've spoken only essentially about this being something on the right, and the susceptibility to it. It isn't just that. I mean, for example, you bring up the Steele dossier, and there are other moments. I mean, America generally, I don't think you can confine it just to the hard right, can you? It's a paranoia that, the paranoia of Trump.
I think that's right. I think, just to go to the Steele dossier for a moment, who in this room thinks Donald Trump is a Kremlin agent? Now, if I'd asked you this question in 2017, I bet you would have had more hands, including possibly mine,
well,
right?
We're British, so everyone would have just thought it but not put their hands.
Right, that's right. Good point. But 2017, me and a bunch of other people at the BBC, we had a little secret office.
I only learned this from the book. It's very exciting.
In the basement of a building that supplied flak jackets to journalists going to war zones, and we would We were trying to find the B tape, right? There was a tape, supposedly, of Donald Trump in a hotel room in Moscow with prostitutes peeing on the bed. And we, let's find the P tape. That would be that would make your career, right? So we had this secret unit, and we met in this room, and we'd kind of ring the buzzer and creep on through, and we're very paranoid, and we'd lock our mobile phones up in lead pouches and pour over the steel dossier, and there was no P tape, right? But Donald Trump, whatever his dodginess, was not a paid asset of the Kremlin, right? But people genuinely thought this. This whole narrative consumed his first presidency in august publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and on and on. It was a conspiracy theory, and it was people in the center and on the left who held to it, and they held to it because they needed a way of explaining how the apparently impossible had happened, right? Everybody said Trump cannot win. Trump cannot win this election. I remember on election night, an hour before the polls closing, looking at the New York Times probability tracker of Hillary Clinton on, I think it was 80, let's be conservative, I think it was 85% probability of winning, and Donald Trump on 15. And then, as the hours passed after the polls closed, these two lines kind of doing an inverted X, right? And everyone was like, WTF? What? How? This can't have just happened. Must have been the Russians. Well, the Russians must have done it, obviously, right? So we're all kind of prone, well, not all, but lots of people are prone to conspiracy theory thinking. The difference, I hope, with me and journalists is that, when you don't find evidence to corroborate what you think is happening, you at some point have to conclude that what you think is happening probably isn't happening, right? So at some point we gave up looking for the P tape and decided that Donald Trump probably wasn't a Kremlin agent. But so that was a kind of liberal left conspiracy theory that had a lot of miles in it. But these days, where the conspiracy theory now in this election coming up is basically, the MAGA lot believe that the institutions of the American government have been captured by a malignant cabal, right? That hidden hands are pulling the strings. There's an incredible stat from a YouGov poll in December last year, where they put the following proposition to 1,000 Americans of all sort of political stripes. They said, no matter who is officially in charge of the government or other organizations, a single group of people secretly control events and rule the world together. How many Americans do you think agreed with that? Go on, give me your best guess. It's obviously going to be big, right? Otherwise you would have brought it up.
I know, but I'll ruin the story if I make it too big. Tell
you
us.
Will. Okay. 41%, right? So that's nearly, it's getting on for half of the electorate. And this is Republicans and Democrats. So, this election, in a sense, is the conspiracy theory election. That is the kind of salient factor. And
what will that look like? Was the storm gonna come?
Cut to the chase. Is the storm coming? We could go through a few scenarios. I mean, basically, you could look at this election. It's clearly not a battle between a sort of centre-left party and a centre-right party who all believe in the establishment, right? It's basically a battle between those who want to preserve the system of government as it is, and if that's what you want, then you'll vote for Kamala Harris, or those who kind of want to kind of tear it down to a large part and start again. And if you want that, you vote for Donald Trump, right? And there are lots of people who kind of would consider themselves to be on the left who are kind of the tear it all down crowd. In answer to your question of is the storm coming, I think, there are two possible outcomes of this. Well, there are three possible outcomes. One is that they keep trying to shoot Donald Trump, which seems like a really bad idea. I mean, really bad idea. Because if they do shoot him, there'll be trouble, right? So, discounting that...
That would be a storm.
That would really be a storm. I think, in all seriousness, that would be a storm. So there are two other possible outcomes. One, he wins, And there's been this Project 2025, which is authored by people in his orbit, which it basically is a blueprint for dismantling the federal government and the institutions of democracy. And Trump may or may not have been joking when he said he was going to be a dictator on day one. I suspect he was joking, but, who knows? Sometimes you should listen to what people say about themselves. So, possibility number one, he wins. And he does indeed try to dismantle the institutions of democracy. He uses the Justice Department to go after his political enemies. And America takes its chances with that onslaught. Are the institutions strong enough to withstand that? Possibility number two, Kamala Harris wins. And all the kind of preserve the system people go, whew, that's a good thing, isn't it? But what does Trump do? Does he say, oh yeah, okay, fair enough, yeah, you won? Or does he say, it was stolen again? Because remember that, tens of millions of Americans, it's orthodoxy in the Republican Party to believe that the 2020 election is stolen. It's not an actual fact, but it's a political fact, right? It wasn't stolen, but politically it's a fact. So if he loses again and he says it was stolen again, a lot of people are going to believe that their democracy is truly broken. And then what? Maybe storm. I'd like to cheer people up.
Yeah. Before I go to audience questions, I feel one of the things that I suppose did trouble me throughout the book is that these conspiracy theories, while they are wild, there are nuggets of truth in a lot of them. And we don't really have time to go into all of it, but you could, I suppose, choose where you go with the nuggets of truth that I found a bit troubling. So you interview Juanita Broderick, who has a story about what Bill Clinton did to her. And you interview a guy in Nevada who has a story about, I wrote in the margins, dodgy FBI. It didn't sound like they were doing their job in that scenario. You do question sort of the FBI's behaviour in quite a lot of things.
Yeah, look, the American...
It doesn't come from nowhere.
The American establishment, especially law enforcement, the FBI, they are frequently doing really bad stuff, right? This is so the conspiracy theory that the FBI has and the Justice Department have gone rogue and have secretly taken over America and are, targeting political dissidents in the kind of Trump movement. There are more than grains of truth to that, and the FBI, as we know from history, has a history of doing dodgy stuff and infiltrating movements and putting in agents provocateurs and all this kind of stuff. So Americans know that this happens, and indeed it is happening. There was this whole story that, there was Hunter Biden's laptop, which was, you can read all
that. That was the third question marks. Yeah.
Hunter Biden's laptop, right? Just before the 2020 election, there was a story that Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son, who was having a tough time with addiction to drugs and all this kind of stuff, had left his laptop in a repair shop, and somebody got hold of it, and they'd seen all this stuff on it, and it kind of made it look like Joe Biden was helping his son make a lot of money while also being vice president of the United States, and it kind of raised all kinds of questions about probity and corruption and all these kinds of things. Now, there wasn't... I got hold of a copy of this laptop, and I looked through it, and there was some stuff that kind of looked a bit smelly, and certainly the kind of stuff that would make big play in the run-up to an election. There wasn't actually any evidence that I could see of criminal corruption. Anyway, this laptop comes out 2 weeks before the 2020 election, and the kind of whole American intelligence community, these 51 ex-CIA and national security officers go, this is Russian disinformation. You should not believe this stuff, right? The FBI goes to Facebook and Twitter and says, you should be on lookout for Russian disinformation. So this story gets squished, right? So literally the New York Post, who published it, got locked out of their Twitter account for publishing fake news. Turned out it wasn't fake news. It was completely true. And the FBI knew it was true because they had the laptop. right? So now it may well be that one half of the FBI didn't know what the other half of the FBI were doing, and the people who were warning Twitter and Facebook to lock the New York Post out of their account because they were peddling fake news hadn't spoken to the guys down the corridor who had the laptop in their drawer. Fuck up always more likely than a conspiracy. But nevertheless, it kind of looks like a conspiracy, right? So these things do happen, and that's why people get very exercised about that.
I said it that I've got one last question. It's just a very human thing, really. When you're in a room with these people, you go to conferences of Q Andon, Mike Flynn's on the stage talking, they're all chanting, get them out, get them out. Do you feel frightened? I mean, and you were just talking, you had Hunter Biden's laptop, you've had quite a lot of extraordinary access. Did you feel nervous?
Yes, occasionally. I mean, despite everything I said about Americans of all stripes being generally very friendly, and generally they are, there are times, especially when you kind of get that group behavior, and you mentioned that conference, Q Andon conference, where they started chanting, fake news, get them out, and they wanted to kind of hound out the journalists. I did feel nervous at that point. I did. But I have found that the policy of being very direct and open with these people and saying, look, I've come here with an open mind. I don't subscribe to your slightly offbeat views and your conspiracy. I probably wouldn't use the word conspiracy theory in that context, but I don't go in there pretending to be a fellow traveller, right? I go in there saying, look, I'm a journalist from the mainstream media. I'm skeptical about this stuff. I'm interested in it and I take it seriously, but I don't think there's any evidence that the election was stolen, let alone by a cabal of satanic paedophiles. I find that the more open you are, the more these people sort of warm to you and feel like you're playing with a straight bat. So if anyone wants to go and hang out with some conspiracy theorists, that's my advice to you.
Do you think the US media aren't getting it right in the way they do it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think ever since Trump, really, the US media has basically gone mad, and they have. I mean, American journalists do great work, and they do, but there is no longer an ability to. They see such an existential threat. I think a lot of these people, CNN, New York Times, it's from Trump and the MAGA movement, that I think they're no longer able to report with a straight bat. I think that is true. And when Biden was declared the winner in 2020, I was in my hotel room. I was watching CNN. I had to switch it off because it was so kind of celebratory. All kind of like there was this whole kind of groundswell of movement still going on. There was reporting to be done, but it was like they were doing victory laps in the studio. It was really extraordinary. I had to switch it off. In fact, I switched on Fox, and I was like, "Oh, this is a bit more like it." I mean, Fox News has various different levels, and they kind of Tucker Carlson opinion journalism is obviously, although Tucker Carlson's not there anymore, but back in the day was pretty off the wall. But a lot of Fox journalists, Fox reporters, absolutely fine and good journalists, and I think we sometimes go a bit overboard in lumping these people all in together.
Fascinating. Right, your turn. Sorry. Great. I think we've got a microphone here. There's a gentleman. Brilliant. And a mic. Let's have the gentleman here, and then we'll come to this lady.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I've been a long-term admirer of Mr. Gatehouse for many years, including his East African work. I also used to teach on training courses as a law enforcement intelligence analyst, the John F. Kennedy case, and I would urge everybody to follow the brilliant description you gave of why people spout the grassy no-nonsense. It's all down to their egos. My question is, regardless of the result of the election, Do you see that you made the federal government versus the states and others? Do you see sort of the major states, I'm thinking particularly of Texas and California and maybe Florida, sort of, in effect, quasi-distancing so? And so we won't have a breakup or a civil war, but we will have away from the centre towards the fringes with huge consequences.
People are talking about that, actually, and they talk about it in terms of soft secession, and the way that, again, you know, these are people who are kind of broadly on the Jeffersonian wing of the kind of you know, suspicion towards the federal government, would quite like it if maybe things fell apart a bit. But what they talk about is the sort of possibility whereby states withhold taxes to the federal government and start spending their taxes only in their states, right? And thereby effectively become kind of a soft secession. Now, I don't know to what extent this is something that is even on the horizon, but this is something that people certainly are talking about.
I mean, that's like the exit as one of the strategies that you described.
Right, yeah. So there's this whole tech movement called the network state movement, which basically is sort of dreamed up by this guy called Balaji Srinivasan, who's protege of Peter Thiel, who was the founder of PayPal, and he's got this idea that, you know, Silicon Valley can do everything better than governments. Obviously, that's what all people in Silicon Valley think. So they can do media better. So bye-bye New York Times, hello TikTok and X and whatever. But they can do all sorts of other stuff. They can do education. They can do finance. They can do law. They can do space travel, right? You know, it's like Elon Musk is. You know, they can disrupt all of that. So they could just do governance better, right? And he describes this in terms of voice versus exit, which was an idea that was formalized by somebody I wrote about in the book and whose name I'm now forgetting. Anyway, he said that basically if you're confronted with an intolerable situation or a situation you don't like, you have two options. Well, you have three options. There's loyalty. If someone's beating you over the head with a baseball bat, you have three options. There's loyalty, which basically means you can just take it. Oh, God. Or you can use your voice to try to ameliorate your situation. So you can say, stop it, I don't like that. And if they don't stop it, you can hit back, right? That's kind of an extension of your voice. Or you can exit. You just get out of there. This guy's beating me with a baseball bat. Get out. And America, in a way, is like this kind of constant tension between voice and exit, right? The Pilgrim Fathers, they didn't like it over here. They got on the Mayflower. They went over there. Exit. But then they got there, and they were like, okay, well, we will now create a better society, right? We will use our voices we will create this democracy. And then some of them didn't like that, so they went out west, you know, the pioneers, and they settled in Utah and Arizona and places like that, and the covered wagons. They exited again, and they set up their own new societies. And eventually, they got to the West Coast, right, in California, and there was no more exit to be done. There was no more land to exit to until the internet, right? And now there's all these people who think that, and this kind of goes back to the sovereign individual idea, you can exit through the internet. You can just become this is the network state idea, you can become a citizen of a franchised cyber statelet of your choice. You would choose your citizenship the same way you choose your gym membership. You like Virgin Active? Great. You could be like a citizen of Soho House. Imagine that.
The conduit.
The conduit, indeed. Well, that would be a rival network state, right? But this would be your country, right? And it would have outposts like colonies, like sort of Grecian colonies of antiquity, you know, outposts in Syracuse and Western Turkey and all this kind of stuff. This is a serious proposition that serious people in Silicon Valley are talking about, and it is this concept of voice versus exit. And the way Balaji Srinivasan describes it is you exit, you create parallel institutions that exist alongside the legacy institutions, and actually have to piggyback along these legacy institutions because they don't have infrastructure like roads and hospitals and schools and blah, blah, blah. But they exist alongside them until they become the new thing. This is his idea, it's not me saying this. Until they become the new thing and they replace them. So that's a vision of the future for you.
Yes. Thank you.
Hi.
You referenced Russia a few times. Is Russia disinformation a conspiracy theory in itself, or is it a serious problem?
No, Russian like the fact that Russians are pushing disinformation, as we know from these recent court cases, is obviously very real. It's a real thing. My point about the Russians is trying not to give them too much credit where it's not due. Right? That these tensions in America between right and left, over race, over class, over between the coastal elites and the kind of the flyover states. These weren't created by Russians. These are organic problems and tensions that exist in America. For sure, the Russian state, in a very kind of opportunistic way, is trying to stir the pot there. But I think it's a stretch to say that the Russians elected Donald Trump, or the Russians caused Brexit. There are some people who believe that. I think that's a cop-out. I think that's a way of not avoiding looking at yourself in the mirror and going, what is actually wrong with our society that these things happening? I shouldn't say wrong. It's very hard to, you can take the man out of the BBC, but it's very hard to take the BBC out of the man. I should say that, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with Brexit, but it was a manifestation of protest, right? That people felt uneasy about what was going on here. Had nothing to do with the Russians. That's my view, anyway.
Lots of questions. Yes, there's.
Hi. Just a quick question. As the lady asked about Russia, my question would be about Saudi Arabia. What is their role behind financing a lot of these conspiracies and a lot of these movements? I'm Brazilian, and we experienced in Brazil in 2016 the coup against the elected president, and then you had Brexit here, and then you have Trump in America. So I don't think it's a conspiracy that the right and the extreme right are very organized and borrowing ideas from each other. But my question really is, what do you think about Saudi involvement in all this?
I think I turned this off. But, there we go. Yeah. I've got to be totally honest with you. I don't know enough about the Saudi subject to be of much use to you there. I do know that that there are obviously there is cross-pollination across different countries, right? Where people see common cause. So you have sort of conservative, Christian Orthodox oligarchs in Russia who make common cause with movements like the National Rifle Association in the United States. And these links are real, and they by the way, make common cause with the right in Brazil, and with Javier Milei in Argentina, who's this kind of libertarian, burn it all down, tear it all up, chainsaw, yeah. And then Hungary, of course, where so there's a lot of cross-pollination. And these people go to each other's countries. They have conferences in each other, and they share ideas and thoughts, and they kind of support each other. So in that sense, there's a network. I'm just kind of reluctant to ascribe one of those nodes in that network as the kind of overarching causal node, as it were, which is often ascribed to Russia and sometimes Saudi.
It's a twofer, I'm afraid, for you. I'm here.
Oh, there you go.
Here I am. First of all, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And then the real question is this just another wave in the cycle of, it's witches and then it's, or is there something more fundamental that has structurally changed such that we don't revert back to some, in quotes, normality?
Well, my glass is quite half empty at the moment, but that's a product of having researched this book. I think by constitution, I'm naturally quite optimistic, and I think that's why I get on with all these kind of crazy people, because I quite like hanging out with them, and I also kind of sort of generally think that things probably won't be as bad as we think they will be when we wake up in the middle of the night worrying about democracy collapsing. What was the second part of your question? Is there a structural change? Yes, is there a structural change? Another blip. Well, the witches, I'm afraid, coincided with a big structural change, right? So it was the end of feudalism and the start of the modern age and capitalism, and it was immense upheaval. And people who had lived in a certain way for centuries and generations, perhaps in very harsh circumstances, but tied to the land with certain certainties, etc., 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 suddenly found themselves vagrants in big cities where the power structures were completely different. The support networks that they knew and relied upon didn't exist anymore, and there was a lot of war and just general stuff going on. It wasn't just the printing press. Obviously, there was the gunpowder revolution. There was changes in the banking system. All kinds of things kind of coincided about 500 years ago that meant that society was basically turned on its head. And I think, and this is the idea of the sovereign individual, but I'm afraid I kind of feel like they're right on this, that this is happening again, right? We're in a kind of once in a half a millennium epochal shift moment where things are going to turn on their head. And we haven't talked about this yet, but AI, guys, is just going to really change everything. It's going to get rid of a lot of jobs, and it's like things are just going to change a lot.
I was just looking, you said you were optimistic. I wrote at the end, terrifying end. But I won't give that away, why it might be. Yeah.
I wonder how can we improve our critical thinking so that we are less susceptible to be exposed to conspiracy theories, but also not to reject everything.
Yeah, I think that's very important. Critical thinking is very important. Well, this is obvious. I think everyone will know this, but just don't believe everything you see online. Don't believe everything you read in the newspaper. Don't believe everything you read on the BBC. Right? I'm not saying question more RT blah blah blah, but don't just double source some stuff and go to different sources and look out other sources of information that come from a different ideological spectrum, because sometimes you will see stuff that may not contradict what you think, but it might show it from a different angle, and then you get a more rounded picture. I mean, I think, again, conspiracy theories, they are useful, right? Because they tell you something about society. They're a little capsule of information, of societal information, and they travel through society, sort of mutating and like a virus, and you watch those mutations, and they tell you something about where we are. So really interesting example, for example, this whole, the debate with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, where Kamala Harris needled him about his crowd sizes, and he just melted down. He's like, they're eating the dogs.
I'm glad we got this in.
They're eating the dogs in Springfield, right? So,
and the cats.
And the cats.
And the geese.
And the geese, right? So where did this come from, right? What is the, were they eating the dogs or the cats? They probably weren't. Maybe someone ate a goose. I don't know, maybe they did. But the point wasn't were they eating the dogs and the cats. The point was who was eating the dogs and the cats. Well, it was the immigrants. These were Haitians, but that didn't really matter that they were Haitians. They were the immigrants. And what was the conspiracy theory about the immigrants? Really, if you scratch the surface of they're eating the dogs, what the real conspiracy theory there is that Kamala Harris and the Democrats have opened the border so that they could flood America with immigrants who are all going to vote Democrat. What? Anyway, that's the conspiracy theory, right? And thereby making America a one-party state forever and imposing tyranny, right? Obviously there are holes in this immediately. Like, how do you know that all these immigrants are going to vote Democrat, if indeed they are going to vote? But, forget the holes for a second. What is that conspiracy theory? That conspiracy theory is the great replacement theory, right? They're opening the borders, they're going to replace us, right? So you see they're eating the dogs, and you just kind of pull at the strings, and then it tells you something interesting about what people are believing. And that's where and I suppose that is critical thinking in a way of taking conspiracy theories seriously, but not literally.
I mean, it's really important, though, to ask. You mentioned the newspapers, you're saying be critical of the BBC, but what about things, I mean, the real problem is things like Twitter. Should we just move away from them if we want to avoid conspiracy theories?
All of my colleagues in respectable journalism all absolutely lost their shit when Elon Musk took over Twitter, right? They had their little blue ticks removed, and they were very upset about that. And they were all like, it was very upsetting, wasn't it? Terribly upsetting. And everyone said, do you remember there was this whole period where everyone's like, I'm leaving. This is my almost last tweet. I'm going to Mastodon. I'm leaving now. That's it. I'm still here. From my perspective, I thought Twitter, I just got a lot more good jazz clips in my timeline. I don't know what happened to my timeline. I got a lot nicer. I don't know what, my algorithm's funny or something. I did get a lot more conspiracy theories. Twitter is a place where you kind of see everything. It's like it's all of life is there. It is a representation of what is going on. I actually don't think we should get rid of Twitter in the same way as we should take conspiracy theories seriously, not literally. I think we should take Twitter seriously, not literally. You know, it is telling you something about what's out there. And if you just read the BBC and the New York Times and whatever, you'd be missing all this stuff. And then suddenly when something weird happens, like Donald Trump gets elected or Brexit happens, you're like, what? I didn't know anyone was thinking of that stuff.
You wouldn't also get to see the video that someone's made about they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, a little mix-up. That is
Exactly.
really worth watching. I'm really sorry if we didn't get to your question, but Gabriel is going to be signing his extraordinary book, aren't you? So you can probably ask him a question in person, and he'll have a glass of wine then, so he'll be even more relaxed. Thank you for your questions. And Gabriel, I just think you're one of the best storytellers, and everyone is just rapt, and that's why we love listening to you.
So kind of
thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.